Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement interview, powered by SIG, and I'm your host, Philip Eidson. And today's show is part of a mini-series of 6 different episodes that I recorded all live at the recent SIG Fall Summit. And this being a live recording, you'll be sure to hear some background noises from baristas making coffee to venue employees taping wire to the carpet. Lots of different little noises in between. We actually had a booth set up in the main corridor of the conference venue, so you're sure to get the atmosphere from the event from those interviews. And so for this mini-series, I'm actually going to jump straight into the conversation. You'll hear me introduce the guest as we get going with the conversation. So with that being said, let's roll the tape. Hi there, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of The Art of Procurement. And I'm here at the SIG Fall Summit in Carlsbad, here in California. We're just wrapping up the conference. So any sights and sounds in the background, you'll hear people kind of packing the conference and all the tables and everything away. So we'll try and keep that noise to a minimum. But I'm delighted actually to be joined here by Kate Vitasek. Kate is from the Faculty of Graduate and Executive Education at the University of Tennessee. And Kate's been on the podcast a couple of times before. So welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me. It's exciting to share some of our research and new work with you guys.
Yeah, it's great to actually be able to do this face-to-face as well, rather than doing it over the phone.
Yeah, it makes it much more interactive, so it's fun.
Well, how's things been going? You know, what have you been up to? It's been a year or so, I think, since you've been on the show.
Yeah, I know. I was looking back, and I was trying to remember the last show that we did. You know, more of the same. People always like, well, what's next, Kate? And I was like, wait, I have a 20-year plan. Until we change the heart and minds of all these procurement people, some of those dinosaurs get to die. We got a lot of work to do. So more of the same, and just building on and continuing to further go deeper in our research and a little bit broader in our research.
Yeah, and I'd recommend any listener who hasn't listened to Kate and I's previous interview. It's back in episode 74. We talked a lot about the principles of vested. We also recorded an episode on sourcing business models, which I don't have the episode number in front of me, but I'm going to include it in the show notes. Go back and listen to that. That'll give you a little bit more context on today's conversation. And related to vested, you know, how you say it's a long-term journey. But even within the last year or so, you know, I hear more and more in industry, more organizations that are adopting the vested methodology. And I'm wondering if what I'm hearing really reflects the work that you're doing and what you're seeing out there.
You know, I'm glad you asked that question because we are seeing that as well, which is, to me, you know, very exciting. You know, we came out with our first book, which is really the birthday. I call it the birthday of Vested, was February of 2010, which was when the book Vested Outsourcing, 5 Rules That Will Transform Outsourcing first launched. And we had 2 loan companies do 2 pilots. So Dell and Intel both did a pilot. And now you look at it, we've had about 275 companies.
Wow.
Sending over 1,300 students to one or more of our paid classes. So that doesn't even count our free open source work, right? So we have a whole course that's a whole program that's open source on, you know, basically Vested 101, what is vested. So you look at those numbers and you're like, wow, people are actually doing this, and they're coming back doing more than one deal.
Right.
So we've had Intel now has a second deal. I'm going to do a case study on that. You've had Telia over in Europe, 4 deals. And so they're now applying more and more. And they're going,
they've
wow.
They've seen the success from the first one.
Yeah, it works, you know. It's so exciting. They're like, it actually worked. I thought it would work, but it did.
So what is the kind of characteristics of the folks that come and take your classes? You know, are they sourcing leads, category leads, procurement executives, a mixture of the above?
You know, that's another great question. It is really a wide mix. About half are on the buy side, and about half are on the sell side. And on the sell side, it's usually it's either sales or the account manager, account director, account VP. So someone who's running that account for that client. Now on the buy side, it really varies. We have procurement people, we have strategic source, so more buyers, more strategic sourcing people, operations people.
Right.
If you think about logistics or facilities management or IT, a lot of times people don't want to actually work with procurement. They want to go around procurement.
They want to do their own deals.
Yeah. And the original people who were attracted to Vested were actually people who didn't want to use procurement. They're like, these guys don't get it.
Right.
There's finally a method that we can use that we don't have to work with procurement. But really when we launched the last book, Strategic Sourcing in the New Economy and Sourcing Business Models, all of a sudden now we start to see tons of procurement people coming. It's almost like before they felt like they had to jump off the cliff. Vested was so far away and so different.
Yeah.
And now with sourcing business models, they're like, well, of course I need to shift up the sourcing continuum. I'm over here and I should be over here. So I think we've made this really logical bridge to help people make that shift.
Right.
So now our class mix is, I'll say, 75% on the buy side. And within that, probably 50% are procurement on the buy side. So really cool to see procurement people embracing our work. Because at first they're like, oh, that's...
We have our own way.
We have our own way. Go away.
Yeah.
Thanks to Dawn and SIG, for being big advocates and just getting behind our work and research and sharing it, because people only do things differently if they're made first aware. If you're not aware, how can you understand? And if you don't understand, you can't implement.
So it starts with a mindset shift.
Yeah.
The folks that come to your programs, are they there necessarily to learn the ins and outs of how to do a deal, or are there organizations sending them because they want them to think differently about what's the art of the possible in some of these supplier relationships?
So actually twofold. So we have 6 courses in our Certified Deal Architect program, and the executive education programs that are more on-site or more in the mindset. You're coming in looking at the art of the possible, learning about case studies and varied case studies. So we'll often teach the Microsoft One Finance, which is a BPO deal. We'll teach the P&G Jones Lang LaSalle deal, which is a facilities management. And so they're starting to see that Vested was really a methodology for how you buy any complex goods or services. They're learning how they have to think differently. They're learning the science behind what we do. It's not just something we made up and, pulled out of the air and said, oh.
Here's your opinion that this sounds like a good idea.
It's based on Nobel Prize winning psychology, social science, and economics. Research. And so the more they can understand the why behind it, the more they're actually willing to accept.
To understand the reasoning and
then
the methodology.
Do the change.
Yeah.
And our actual course where we teach the details, the deep dive of the how is an online course. And I think it's pretty cool. It's designed for buyers and suppliers to take together. And your homework is your contract.
Yeah.
And so, because if you think about it just one side, what if only the supplier took the course or only the buy side took the course? They're not really co-creating.
Yeah, you're not in sync.
You're not in sync. You could still be using different languages, different ways. And so we teach the methodology, and it's designed for a buyer team and a supplier team. We call it a deal architect team. So the architect team, note, I don't say the buyers and the suppliers. They're not buying and selling. They're architecting a win-win deal.
Yeah, an outcome.
Yep.
Basically.
Yep. And their homework is their contract. So pretty cool.
Yeah. So what are you working on right now? What are some of the key emerging trends or things that are at the forefront of your mind in your teaching and kind of what you're tracking as it relates to supply chain procurement? Well,
I'll tell you one of the most interesting problems that we've seen come across our desk was actually the Canadian government, because they had read about our work. They'd really done a lot of homework saying this looks like a really cool methodology. But so many of the companies that were applying Vested do what we call flips. So they take an existing relationship, an existing contract, and they're choosing to restructure it. So they could go out to bid, but Dell is a perfect example. They're one of our case studies. So they had worked with Genco FedEx services for 8 years. So 3 different bid cycles, pick them every time, and their procurement policy said, I have to go to bid. And they started to look at the existing relationship and contract, and all of a sudden, remorse hits in and says, gosh, I got what I paid for. Maybe the supplier is a good supplier. Right. And if I bid this out, I'm probably going to go back to FedEx again. So why don't I think about restructuring? And so they were a classic example of where someone does what we call a flip. And I love to study these because they show clearly same scope, same people, same everything. Yeah. All you do is change the way you buy and sell and truly create this win-win deal. So the vast majority of deals we see are these flips. So when the Canadian government came to us, they said, we really like vested, but we're the government, and by law, we have to bid. So how would you take vested and embed it into a bidding process? And we'd been toying with this, and this for a while. We were kind of calling it a request for partner process, and they gave us really the test bed to pilot this process, and it was very successful actually. And they now have done, the Canadian government's on their 4th deal, so it's pretty cool to see them. And they've been so generous that they've allowed us to profile their case study. And so we have a wonderful white paper that's been quite popular, actually. I've been really surprised at how popular it is, especially among governments. State of Tennessee's now piloted the process. And it really says, how do we bring in the vested 5 rules and these contractual elements right up front into the bid process? So it's really a more collaborative, solution-oriented, you're seeking a partner and not a proposal for a spec.
Right, because you don't know what the spec is. And actually, I'm going to link up to that white paper just as an aside in the show notes. I'll give the show notes towards the end of the episode. But you're essentially buying an outcome. You're buying an innovation. You're not really sure what the scope of work is. And so you're partnering with somebody to figure that out. How do they help you build a business, solve a business challenge by the sounds of it, as opposed to something that's more defined? Yeah,
you think about the traditional request for partner process, and you write the requirements. You've given the supplier the spec, and then you bid it out, and the suppliers are apples, to apples. And I've seen the grading sheets for suppliers, and oftentimes the buyer has an Excel spreadsheet, so they have little requirements on the side, and they have, each column's a different...
I've been there and done that.
Each column's a different supplier, and, you're adding it up and you're scoring them, and it's an apple to apple comparison, and then you're trying to do a best value. If you're really cool, you're doing a best value analysis. But the point is, you've outsourced, you want to outsource to the expert. You're not the expert. You can't write the requirements. Yeah. And then think about it this way. A true desired outcome is the future. It's a desired outcome. So how do you buy the future? Yeah. How do you buy innovation? You can't write a spec for that. So we really have to bring in the suppliers as experts to help co-create during that bidding process. Very collaborative approach right up front into the bid.
So how do you do that then? By definition, a bidding process is more than one party bidding for work, with others. So do you bring all of them into the process or run the same process with multiple different suppliers all at the same time? So you can still do that. Some kind of definition of what success looks like as you put one against another, or I'm interested how kind of the process that you go through and how you involve the different parties in that.
Yeah, and in the white paper, there's actually 6 steps in the process that's broken down into 20 more discrete steps. We teach in the white paper to have a parallel process, but a very quick down select. Okay. But we have seen in the state of Tennessee, for example, brought all the suppliers together in one room. We don't believe that's as efficient. So it worked. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. It did work. They got a good end result, but it is hard to pull off. And I think the process where you kind of do a parallel is a little bit better. And the reason why is you want to be as transparent as possible with these suppliers, because they will feed on that. So the more information you give them, the better their solution. So you start out with a bunch of suppliers. Yeah. And so you're just simply picking a few, 3, no more than 6, based on pure capabilities. So you're capable, you're in the mix. So let's say, well, in the Vancouver Coastal Health example, in their original process that we write about in the white paper and in the case study, they started with 3 capable suppliers.
Yeah.
So you couldn't even get in unless you were known to be capable. And then they move into what's called a concept phase. So the concept phase is where you start to give as much information as you can to these 3 suppliers, very transparent. And the suppliers then have direct access to your stakeholders.
Okay.
So it's not procurement.
You're not protecting somebody.
No. Yeah, so there's no middleman. And it's like, all right, we're going to bring in, our OR nurses today because you're going to be bidding on how to do environmental services in the OR. Well, OR environmental services are very different than ER. The emergency room are very, very different than the nursing homes. And so they actually have direct access to the stakeholders. They have data. And so they get to ask whatever, if they have a question, you ask it. And what I liked about the Vancouver Coastal Health process is that the questions were proprietary. So if a supplier asked a question, the supplier got information. And the better questions they ask, the better their solution. So you could really start to see the suppliers who were smarter because they built on
more interesting questions.
More interesting questions, got better data, could do better solutions. So you're giving a very short period for the concept because this takes a lot of time and energy from the suppliers, and so you don't want to draw them out. So you want to, if you've ever heard that term, throw spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks, right? So you're giving them. In the Canadian government also is doing an IT deal right now, which is publicly out there. Their RFP is they gave each supplier a week, one dedicated week to come and interact and collect your data, do whatever.
So each party gets that week of unvetted access essentially to the people that they need. Go at it and see what you can get that will help you define a solution or deliver an outcome, essentially.
So you throw it up on the wall, get feedback, kind of see what sticks. And so there's criteria. So just like any bid process, you need to have criteria. We advocate for very transparent criteria. So don't go changing the rules after the fact.
Because you like somebody who was a salesperson at one of the organizations, so you change the process so that they end up being the winner.
And we want the suppliers to understand the criteria, to understand the weighting of that criteria, so it's very clear how they're going to get selected. And so the best suppliers then go through. So usually that's 2 suppliers. So if you start out with 4, now you've got 2. And now you're going to go through the same process, but a little bit more protracted. So they're going to get access to even more information. So in Vancouver Coastal Health, for example, they gave access to the full budget data. Here's what it costs today. Here's everything we know, right? Now go play with that data. Help us understand how we could actually be better, faster, cheaper, smarter. So you go through this very interactive, collaborative solutioning phase. And in an RF partner process, you actually are picking the supplier not only on their solution, but on their cultural fit and compatibility. Because, like it or not, fit matters. I say drug dealers shouldn't marry Southern Baptists. It's just not going to work.
Culture is so important. Even aside from doing a deal that's based around vested in any relationship, I think it's something that we overlook until you're actually working with somebody and then you realize, I should have really paid more attention to the cultural fit and not just the price.
Yeah, and people say that. It's actually in the Procter & Gamble case study how important cultural fit was, but you very rarely see it actually embedded into the RFP process. And then you get buyers who select on the criteria and they're like, dang, that's not the one I liked, right? And you know what? Just be fair and upfront and go, here's what we're looking for on the cultural fit. So in the RF partner process, they, buyer and supplier team actually create a mutual shared vision, the behaviors, we call it a statement of intent. So it's actually outlining the guiding principles and behaviors that they will work as a team. And that's actually evaluated. How well they work together, how well they gelled is part of the evaluation.
So what's the feedback loop for those suppliers who have gone through this process? They had access to all that information. You decided that perhaps they're not the ones that understand the challenge the most, and so they're eliminated from the process. How do you feed back so they can take learning from it.
Yeah, well, that actually should absolutely be part of the process. You never want to leave a supplier in the dry of why they lost, because they should come back and be evaluated on that. So if you think about Vancouver Coastal Health, there were 3 suppliers in that deal: Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass. And Compass ultimately won. And they do a formal debrief. Well, Sodexo was the one that was eliminated first. They've been now in our classes in the University of Tennessee and trying to understand, wow, this is the mindset. Because if you don't understand the mindset of vested, you're probably not going to do a good job during the bid process. And it was really just that they knew that the government was using the vested methodology, but they hadn't really, they read the book and said, oh, I read the book, I got it. So now they actually, Sodexo, you got to be proud of them. They have 2 certified deal architects, right? So when they have a bid process, they put their certified deal architects on that because they know that you're buying outcomes. You're creating a win-win model. The solution matters. It's not the fact that you can show up and, serve a meal or clean the toilets. It's the solution is a very critical role, and that cultural fit is important, and putting the right people on the team. One of the criteria that we actually teach is the bid team is also the contracting team, is also the governance team. And so that at least 1/3, we recommend half of the people that were on the bid are actually managing that deal.
Right. So they they have the relationships with the process, but they also understand how the deal needs to be managed to live up to the commitments and the trust essentially that's built through the bid process and the reality of managing, because I'm sure there's a risk of you hand it off to somebody and they don't manage the deal in the intent of which it was scoped, and that just breaks the trust that was built. Yeah,
and it's fun to hear Vancouver Coastal Health and Compass talk about the process, and Lita Hill is the account executive on that account, and they banter back and forth when they do a presentation, and Lita's like, I have to look at David every day. I sold him this, I contracted for this, and I have to deliver this. So it really increases that accountability. It's not a throw it over your fence. It was a very collaborative dialogue. And you really are seeking a partner who understands your needs, because you are buying the future. You're not buying toilet washers. And
you don't know what you're necessarily buying. How do you make sure, and I think it comes down to trust, but how do you make sure that one party then doesn't take advantage of the other, both when you're only negotiating a deal between these 2 parties. Now you've gone through a process where you may not have talked much about cost because you're still figuring out what the solution looks like. In that old mindset, and the traditional mindset, you're always looking at how am I going to get taken advantage of? So how do we take that out of the equation?
Yeah, well, actually through the process, even in the concept, you don't have a price, but you actually are proposing your pricing model. So a framework for how you would think about it. And I know, for example, the state of Tennessee and the BC government on their IT deal, transparency is absolutely essential. So you get more points the more transparent you are. And they are grading how well your model is a win-win model. So it's not this price versus, here's the price and I'm going to hold you hostage later. It really is a pricing model. Usually these deals are cost pass-through. So the cost is the cost is the cost. And so you start to see transparently the supplier's margin. And the supplier's margin is pegged to how well they achieve the outcomes. So if you're buying the future, how well did you...
That's the risk and reward that's built into it.
That's right. So having them understand the pricing model, and this is why we're starting to see some of the suppliers definitely come back and taking our classes, because they need to get the logic of, well, when our client says they want to do a vested deal and they're talking about a pricing model, what is that? Because so many of them have only ever sold, and answered a traditional RFP. They're not bringing their creative thinking, even though they might have a wonderful company that has the capability to drive innovation. If they don't know how to articulate that and work in a more collaborative way, they're not going to be a good fit.
How long does this process usually take? I imagine it's something that we're using for the services or even products that are so material to the business that you really need to bring in innovation, but that's an investment of time. it's not something that we can apply to everything.
It's we actually share the timeline that Vancouver Coastal Health used in the white paper, and I kind of wish we didn't because I think it scares people away. Keep in mind that was a government deal, very specific, and they
still
have,
iterative, and they have to go through all their channels.
And so from the time, I don't count all the RFQ getting the qualified suppliers, but from the time they got the qualified suppliers to the time they were under contract was about a year. But that is actually not uncommon in a large government deal. But we actually have seen it tested in a 16-week cycle.
Right.
So not really different than what you might see in a traditional bid process. The difference is it's the same time and energy. You're just putting it in a different way, right? You're using that time and energy in a very different way. And the contract actually follows on. So if you think about it being a big funnel, right? You have your qualified suppliers who are then competing on a concept, and then the two max 3 who would go down to that solution. Well, then your contract falls out of that. And so we find that there's very little actual negotiation at all because it's refining.
Because you built it through the process.
You built it into the process. That's right. So it's a refining part, and people go, when are we going to negotiate? And it's like, well, you're actually not. And they don't ever believe me until they finish. And they're like, we didn't really negotiate. How did that work? And I was like, no, you designed this in.
Yeah. You don't need to negotiate if everything's on the table.
Yeah. And that's actually talking about things being on the table. This is, people look at this and they think, oh my gosh, really? We have to do that? We call it guardrails. So guardrails are kind of like, in traditional negotiation term, your BATNA, your best alternative no negotiated agreement. So in traditional negotiation, would you ever share your BATNA?
No.
Yeah. So in the vested process, you actually always share your BATNA, and you share it up front. Don't even tell a supplier you're going to do a deal if you don't know what your walkaway is. But people think they're very vulnerable. And the supplier, part of what they're evaluated on is also their BATNA, their guardrails. Because if we can't agree up front that we're going to get to a deal within the zone, then we're not going to get there.
It's a wasted journey.
It's a wasted journey. Instead of, well, let me, kind of get there and we'll negotiate this later. The last thing you want to do is have surprises at the 11th hour with lawyers. And I've seen a lot of times where people have gone through these more collaborative type processes and they didn't bring in the contractual design into the bid. And they're like, wow, we've picked this wonderful solution, this wonderful supplier. And then all of that value gets negotiated away because they didn't talk about those guardrails. So it's really scary for a lot of people to think about guardrails. I know the Canadian government, they literally, they're just like, you want us to what? I say, give them your budget. They're like, if we give them our budget as a guardrail, then they'll just take advantage of us.
They'll figure out a model which takes the very top of that budget, or maybe a little bit more.
And what you actually found was the opposite, is they want to win and they're trying to optimize for your budget. You know what? The goal, one of the desired outcomes, was to make the budget go down through efficiencies. And so now they're proposing how they can take your budget as a baseline and over time make it more efficient. And the more efficient they spend your money in a cost pass-through, the more profit they make. It's not about paying, getting paid per hour, per widget, per unit. The less widgets, the less hours, the less miles, whatever it is we're buying, the less is actually more valuable.
So as somebody who's, if someone's listening to this and they have a need to buy something that they're not really sure what it is that they're buying because it's innovative, it's something that they're going to be building with a solution or an outcome that they want to achieve with a supplier, they're interested in going through this process. What do they need to start? What's kind of the foundation? Is it a knowledge, or is it getting people on board within the organization to see that this different approach is something that's actually something that they should be investing in and a process that they should be going on?
Yeah, and then what I would always say is you first need to be aware before you, and then you understand, and then you can implement. And so this is why so much of our work is open source, because you're never going to come to learn from our class if you don't feel comfortable with the concepts.
Right.
So take our white paper, the Unpacking Collaborative Bidding. Take the Vancouver Coastal Health case study. Thank you guys for letting us profile you. I have to, give shout outs to the guys up there. But take the case studies, take the white papers, socialize them, and if it feels like what you're trying to buy is innovative or is risky, so why do you vested shares risk and shares reward? Yep. And so the more risky something is, the more value that can be created, the more innovation that I want, the more I'm unknown. That's when you want to move into into a vested model. That's when you want to start to use an RF partner process. So begin to look at and just say, is this something I can do? Because if your organization won't support it, don't start down a path and tell suppliers, oh, look what we're doing, and then, oh, we're going to bring that lawyer in at the last.
Yeah, and you're eroding all the trust again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use the process, mean it, right? There are no shortcuts, and anyone who's gone through and done deals will tell you that. The best learning they had was don't shortcut the process. The process leads you to the answer. Trust the process.
Well, I would highly encourage anybody who's listening, who's thinking about buying something that's innovative, to really look at different ways of doing things, because I think that's where value is created. When we look to the future of procurement, value is created by taking what's out there in the supply markets, applying it in new ways, not going through a traditional process. And the way we think about that today is still mostly through our old process lens. And that's sometimes where we get hung up on. We try and apply buying something new to the way that we bought something before. So I definitely encourage folks to go and download the white paper for starters. I'm going to include the links to that on the show notes for today. That'll be at artofprocurement.com/collaborative bidding. There'll be the links to the white paper, to the open source material. Also, I'll provide links to Vested and to your profile on LinkedIn if anybody would like to reach out, connect, learn a little bit more.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for allowing us to come and share what we're up to.
No, I'm delighted you were able to join me, and thank you again, Kate. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.